Rachel Thompson sprinted through the marble corridors of the Grandview Hotel, her lavender bridesmaid dress billowing behind her like a silk parachute caught in a windstorm. The fabric twisted around her legs with each frantic step, threatening to send her tumbling onto the plush carpet that lined the hallway. Her heels clicked in urgent rhythm against the polished floor, a soundtrack to her mounting panic. The scent of fresh lilies from the elaborate floral arrangements filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of her own nervous sweat. This was supposed to be a perfect day. Hannah, her closest friend since college, was getting married to the love of her life, and Rachel had promised to be there early to help with every last detail. Instead, she was running catastrophically late, thanks to a series of unfortunate events that felt like the universe conspiring against her. The morning had started with her alarm failing to go off, followed by a coffee spill on her first dress choice, and then a subway delay that added another 20 minutes to her commute. By the time she'd finally arrived at the hotel, the ceremony was minutes from starting. Rachel adjusted her grip on the bouquet of white peonies she clutched in one sweaty palm, the delicate petals already looking slightly wilted from her death grip. Her other hand held up the hem of her dress, revealing the strappy silver heels that were currently her worst enemy. She'd practiced walking in them at home, gliding gracefully across her apartment's hardwood floors. But that was before she had to navigate crowded hotel lobbies and climb emergency staircases, because the elevator was packed tighter than a subway car at rush hour. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, doors to various function rooms blurring past as she ran. She could hear the muffled sounds of music drifting from somewhere ahead, the classical strings that signaled the ceremony was about to begin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat reminding her that she was failing at the one job Hannah had asked of her. Be there. Be on time. Don't let me down. Rachel rounded a corner at full speed, her eyes focused on the ornate double doors at the end of the hallway that led to the grand ballroom. So close. Just a few more steps and she could slip in through the side entrance, take her place with the other bridesmaids, and pretend this morning's chaos had never happened. She took a deep breath, ready to make her final push. Then everything went wrong. She collided with something solid and unmovable, the impact jarring enough to knock the air from her lungs. Her bouquet flew from her hand, white petals scattering across the carpet like snow. Her small, clutch purse hit the floor with a dull thud, the contents spilling out in a mortifying display. Lipstick, breath mints, her phone, all rolling away in different directions. Rachel felt herself falling backward, her ankles wobbling in those treacherous heels, gravity pulling her down toward what was sure to be a humiliating landing, but strong hands caught her before she hit the ground, fingers wrapped firmly around her waist, steadying her with surprising gentleness. The hands pulled her upright, and Rachel found herself pressed against a solid chest, breathing in an intoxicating scent of sandalwood, citrus that cut through her panic like a knife through butter. For a moment, she kept her eyes squeezed shut, mortified beyond belief. Please don't let this be some elderly guest with a bad back, she thought desperately. Please don't let me have just tackled a grandfather. A deep voice rumbled above her head, rich and smooth like aged whiskey. The words carried a hint of amusement that made her stomach flip for reasons that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Rachel's eyes snapped open, and she found herself staring at a perfectly pressed white dress shirt, the top button undone to reveal a glimpse of tanned skin at the collar. Slowly, she tilted her head back, following the line of a strong jaw, shadowed with the barest hint of stubble, past lips that curved in a subtle smile, until she met the most striking pair of eyes she'd ever seen. They were a deep gray like storm clouds over the ocean, framed by dark lashes that no man had any right to possess. The man holding her was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair styled in a way that looked effortlessly perfect. His charcoal suit fit him like it had been custom-made, which it probably had been, emphasizing broad shoulders and a lean, athletic build. Everything about him screamed money and power. From the platinum watch on his wrist to the confident way he held himself, Rachel realized. She'd been staring for several seconds without saying anything. Heat flooded her cheeks. She was certain her face now matched the pink roses in the ceremony arrangements. The man's smile widened just a fraction, revealing perfect white teeth. His hands were still on her waist, warm through the thin fabric of her dress. And she became acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected. Rachel stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over her own feet again in her haste to put distance between them. His hands released her immediately, but his eyes remained locked on hers. Studying her with an intensity that made her skin tingle, she bent down to gather her scattered belongings, shoving everything back into her clutch with shaking hands. The lipstick had rolled under a decorative table, and she had to get on her knees to reach it, completely destroying what little remained of her dignity. When she stood up, smoothing down her dress, the man was collecting her bouquet. He held it out to her, several petals missing, but still mostly intact. Rachel snatched the flowers from him, avoiding his gaze. Up close, she could see fine details she'd missed before. The way his suit jacket moved when he breathed, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way one corner of his mouth quirked higher than the other when he smiled. She forced herself to focus, pushing past the strange flutter in her chest. There was no time for this, whatever this was. Hannah was waiting, probably having a panic attack about her missing bridesmaid. Rachel needed to get into that ballroom immediately, but as she tried to step around him, she felt a sharp tug on her dress. Looking down, she saw with horror that the hem had somehow gotten caught on the heel of her shoe, the delicate fabric pulling tight. She tugged experimentally, heard the ominous sound of threads beginning to tear. Before she could process this latest disaster, the man crouched down in front of her. His fingers worked quickly and efficiently, untangling the fabric from her heel with practiced ease. Rachel stared down at the top of his head, noticing the way his hair fell forward, thick and slightly wavy. The position put him disconcertingly close to her legs, and she had to resist the urge to step back and make everything worse. He stood up smoothly, brushing off his hands. There was something almost playful in his expression now, like he was enjoying her obvious discomfort. Rachel bristled at his tone despite the truth of his words. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin to meet his gaze with as much dignity she could muster while still flushed and disheveled. The corner of his mouth twitched, and for a second she thought he might laugh. Instead, he simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt oddly formal given the circumstances. Rachel didn't wait for more. She hurried past him toward the ballroom doors, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire way, a weight that made her hyper-aware of every movement. "Don't look back," she told herself firmly. "Just get inside and forget this ever happened." She slipped through the side entrance just as the processional music began to swell. The ballroom was breathtaking, all white flowers and golden candlelight, with rows of guests seated in elegant chairs tied with silk ribbons. Rachel spotted the other bridesmaids lined up near the altar and rushed to join them. Trying to make herself invisible, Hannah, radiant in her wedding gown, caught her eye from across the room. Her expression was a mixture of relief and exasperation, clearly asking, "Where have you been?" Rachel mouthed an apology, clutching her battered bouquet close to her chest as the ceremony began. Rachel tried to focus on the beautiful moment unfolding before her. The officiant's words about love and commitment, the way Hannah's fiancé looked at her like she hung the moon, the sweet vows they'd written for each other. But her attention kept drifting, scanning the rows of guests on the groom's side. And then she saw him. The man from the hallway, seated in the third row, watching the ceremony with the same intense focus he'd directed at her minutes earlier. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head slightly, and their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Mia, the bridesmaid standing next to her, leaned in close and whispered urgently. Rachel tore her eyes away from the stranger, looking at Mia with confusion. Mia's eyes went wide, and she grabbed Rachel's arm. Rachel felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Benjamin Cole. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. He was one of the youngest tech CEOs in the country, having built a software empire before he was 30. His company had revolutionized cloud computing, making him a fixture in business magazines and a regular on lists of the world's most eligible bachelors. He was brilliant, ruthless in business, and notoriously private about his personal life, and she'd just crashed into him at full speed. Been rude to his foes, and generally made a complete fool of herself. Rachel's hands tightened on her bouquet, crushing the already abused peonies. This day just kept getting better and better. She forced herself to focus on the ceremony, watching as Hannah and Thomas exchanged rings, but she could still feel Benjamin's gaze on her like a physical touch. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, and the ballroom erupted in applause, Rachel clapped mechanically. Her mind was already racing ahead to the reception, calculating how she could possibly avoid further humiliation. Maybe she could hide in the bathroom, or fake a sudden illness and leave early. Anything to avoid another encounter with Benjamin Cole and those knowing gray eyes. But deep down, beneath the embarrassment and panic, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to avoid him at all. And that thought was more terrifying than anything else that had happened today. The reception hall glowed with warmth and elegance, transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting prismatic light across the polished marble floors. Round tables draped in cream linens surrounded a spacious dance floor. Each centerpiece a towering arrangement of ivory roses and trailing greenery. The air hummed with conversation and laughter, punctuated by the clink of champagne flutes and the soft melodies of a string quartet in the corner. Rachel moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, her bridesmaid duties keeping her blessedly occupied. She adjusted Hannah's veil, handed out tissues to teary relatives, and directed confused guests toward their assigned tables. Anything to keep her mind off the man she knew was somewhere in this room, probably watching her with that same unreadable expression he'd worn during the ceremony. She paused by the bar, suddenly desperate for something to calm her nerves. The bartender, a friendly woman with silver hair, smiled warmly and asked what she wanted. Rachel scanned the options, her eyes landing on the deep red wine that looked strong enough to blur the edges of this increasingly surreal day. The bartender poured generously, the dark liquid swirling in the glass like liquid ruby. Rachel lifted it carefully, the stem cooled between her fingers, and took a small sip. The wine was rich and full-bodied, with notes of blackberry and oak that warmed her throat on the way down. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. Then she turned, to find a quiet corner where she could collect herself before the formal dinner began. But the universe, it seemed, had not finished testing her today. Rachel collided with a solid wall of expensive suit for the second time that day. The impact sent her stumbling backward, and she watched in slow-motion horror as the wine glass tilted in her hand. Dark red liquid arced through the air like a crimson ribbon, splashing across crisp, white fabric in a pattern that looked almost artistic in its destruction. The wine hit Benjamin Cole's shirt and jacket with enough force to splatter, drops flying up to catch his jaw and collar. It soaked into the expensive material immediately, spreading in an ever-widening stain that looked like a wine-colored accusation. Against the pristine white, Rachel stood frozen, the empty glass dangling from her fingers. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Around them, nearby guests had noticed the commotion, conversations pausing as heads turned to stare at the spectacle she'd created. Benjamin looked down at his ruined shirt, then back up at her. His face was completely unreadable, those storm-gray eyes revealing nothing. A drop of wine traced a path down his jaw, and Rachel had the insane urge to reach out and wipe it away. Finally, her voice returned, high and strangled with mortification. She thrust the empty glass at a passing server and grabbed a cloth napkin from the nearest table. Stepping toward him with shaking hands, Benjamin caught her wrist gently before she could start dabbing at his chest. His fingers were warm and firm, his thumb resting against her racing pulse. The touch sent electricity shooting up her arm, and Rachel froze again, trapped by the intensity of his gaze. His voice was low and controlled, carrying that same hint of amusement that had infuriated her in the hallway. Up close, she could see the wine had splattered across the sharp line of his collarbone where his shirt opened, a sight that made her mouth go dry for reasons having nothing to do with embarrassment. Rachel pulled her hand back, clutching the napkin like a lifeline. Heat flooded her face, and she knew she must be bright red by now. Several nearby guests were still watching, whispering behind their hands. And she wanted nothing more than for the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Benjamin set his own wine glass down on a nearby table and shrugged out of his jacket with fluid grace. The movement revealed more of the stained shirt, the wet fabric clinging to a chest that was clearly well maintained. He rolled up his sleeves methodically, exposing strong forearms dusted with dark hair, his movements precise and unhurried. Despite the attention they were attracting, Rachel realized she was staring again and forced her eyes back to his face. He was watching her with that subtle smile playing at his lips, clearly aware of the effect he was having. She bristled, defensive instincts kicking in to combat her embarrassment. Her fingers twisted the napkin into a knot. Benjamin's smile widened fractionally, a flash of white teeth that transformed his face from handsome to devastating. He gestured toward the bar with a slight tilt of his head, the movement casual but somehow commanding. Rachel's heart stuttered in her chest. This was dangerous territory. Every instinct screamed at her to make an excuse and flee. But something about the challenge in his eyes, the way he stood there in his wine-stained shirt looking completely unbothered by the disaster she'd created, made her spine straighten. She heard herself agree before her brain could override the decision. Benjamin's expression shifted, something warm flickering in those gray depths, and he placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her through the crowd. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent heat radiating through her entire body. The bar area was quieter, slightly removed from the main reception floor. Tall cocktail tables stood scattered around the polished wood counter, and the lighting was softer here, more intimate. Rachel climbed onto one of the high stools, the leather seat cool through the thin fabric of her dress. Benjamin settled onto the stool beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixing with the sharp scent of wine. The bartender approached with raised eyebrows. Clearly having witnessed the earlier catastrophe, Benjamin ordered 2 whiskeys, neat, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of people listening when he spoke. Rachel found herself studying him in the dim light. Without his jacket, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and wine stains marking his otherwise impeccable appearance, he looked more human, more approachable, but there was still something about him that set her on edge. A coiled energy beneath the calm exterior that suggested dangerous depths. The whiskeys arrived in heavy crystal tumblers, the amber liquid catching the light. Benjamin lifted his glass in a small salute, and Rachel mirrored the gesture, the crystal clinking softly when they touched. The whiskey burned going down, smooth but powerful, leaving trails of heat in its wake. Rachel savored it, letting the warmth settle in her stomach and loosen the knot of anxiety that had been building all day. Benjamin took a sip of his own drink, never breaking eye contact. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt charged, full of unspoken questions and possibilities that made Rachel's pulse quicken. Rachel laughed despite herself, the sound escaping before she could stop it. She took another sip of whiskey, the burn familiar now. Grounding. Benjamin leaned back slightly, studying her with open curiosity now. The wine stain on his shirt had spread further, but he seemed completely unconcerned about it. One hand rested on the bar, fingers drumming a slow rhythm that matched the distant music. Rachel set her glass down carefully, tracing the rim with one finger. The question felt too personal, too intimate for someone she'd known for less than an hour. But the whiskey had loosened her tongue, and she genuinely wanted to know what brought a man like Benjamin, Cole, to a wedding where he clearly wasn't the center of attention. Benjamin's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the liquid coat the sides before answering. Something about the way he said it, the slight emphasis on the word all, suggested there was more to his life than boardrooms and business deals. Rachel found herself leaning in slightly, drawn by the hint of vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out with more honesty than she'd intended. The whiskey was definitely going to her head, making her bold in ways that would probably mortify her tomorrow. Benjamin's eyes crinkled at the corners, his smile growing wider. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, less guarded. The sight did dangerous things to Rachel's already racing heart. Rachel rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress her own smile. This was surreal. She was sitting at a bar, trading banter with one of the most successful men in the country. While he wore her wine stain like a badge of honor, nothing about this day had gone according to plan, but somehow impossibly. This moment felt right. They talked for longer than Rachel intended, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Benjamin asked about her work as an architect. She found herself describing her passion for creating spaces that enhance people's lives. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the creative process in a way that surprised her. In turn, he spoke about his company, but not in the rehearsed way of someone giving an investor pitch. He talked about the challenges of scaling a business while maintaining its original vision. The pressure of being responsible for thousands of employees, the isolation that came with success. There was a loneliness beneath his words that resonated with something in Rachel's own life. The music from the reception grew louder as the band replaced the string quartet. Upbeat jazz filled the air, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Rachel glanced over, seeing Hannah and Thomas swaying together in the center, lost in their own world. Benjamin followed her gaze, then turned back to her. He stood, extending his hand in a gesture that was both invitation and challenge. Rachel's breath caught. Dancing with him felt like crossing another line, moving from accidental encounters into deliberate choice. But his hand was steady in front of her. The warmth in his eyes made her brave. She placed her hand in his, feeling his fingers close around hers with confident gentleness. He led her to the edge of the dance floor, away from the crowd, but still within the music's embrace. When he pulled her close, his hand settling on her waist. Rachel's entire world narrowed to the points where their bodies connected. They moved together with surprising synchronization. Benjamin leading with subtle pressure that she followed instinctively. He was an excellent dancer, his movements controlled and precise, yet somehow managing to make it feel natural rather than rehearsed. Rachel's free hand rested on his shoulder, feeling the flecks of muscle beneath the wine-stained shirt. Up close, she could see the individual droplets of wine caught in the fabric. The way the stain had spread across his chest in an abstract pattern, she'd marked him literally. The thought sent an unexpected thrill through her. Benjamin's hand tightened slightly on her waist, drawing her incrementally closer. His voice was low when he spoke, his breath warm against her ear. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Rachel tilted her head back to look at him, searching his face for signs of teasing or manipulation. But his expression was serious now, open in a way that made her chest tight. She didn't know how to respond to that kind of honesty. Men like Benjamin Cole didn't say things like that to women they'd just met. They played games, kept their cards close, protected themselves behind walls of wealth and power. But here he was, dancing with her in a wine-stained shirt, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. The song ended, transitioning into something slower and more intimate. Couples around them shifted, moving closer together, and Benjamin showed no sign of letting her go. If anything, he pulled her nearer, until she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her chest. They danced through 2 more songs without speaking, communication happening through touch and shared breath. Rachel felt herself relaxing into his embrace, her head finding its way to his shoulder, breathing in the scent of wine and sandalwood that would forever be linked to this moment in her memory. When the band took a break, they pulled apart slowly, reluctantly. Benjamin's hand lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb tracing a small circle that sent shivers down her spine. Rachel nodded, not trusting her voice. As they walked back toward the main reception area, she caught sight of Mia watching them with wide eyes and a knowing smile. Hannah was also looking their way, her expression a mixture of surprise and delight that promised an interrogation later. The reception was winding down, guests beginning to drift toward the exits. Rachel knew she should stay and help with cleanup, fulfill her bridesmaid duties to the end. But when Benjamin suggested giving her a ride home, claiming it was too late for her to navigate public transportation alone, she found herself agreeing. His car was sleek and expensive, exactly what she'd expected, with leather seats that smelled new and a dashboard that looked like something out of a spaceship. Benjamin drove with the same controlled confidence he brought to everything else, navigating the city's streets with ease. The silence between them was comfortable now, charged with possibility, but no longer awkward. Rachel watched the city lights blur past her window, processing everything that had happened in the span of a single day. This morning, she'd been worried about being late to a wedding. Now she was sitting in a luxury car next to a man who made her feel things she hadn't felt in years. When they pulled up in front of her apartment building, Benjamin put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. Rachel hesitated, her hand on the door handle, suddenly unsure of how to end this strange and wonderful evening. Benjamin turned to face her fully, his gray eyes luminous in the streetlight filtering through the windshield. Rachel's mouth went dry. She should say something witty, play it cool, protect herself from the inevitable disappointment that came from wanting something too much. But all she could manage was honesty. Benjamin's smile was soft and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made her chest ache. Rachel climbed out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. She watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the corner. And only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the terrifying truth. In less than 12 hours, Benjamin Cole had become someone she couldn't stop thinking about, and she had no idea what to do about it. The following Monday arrived with the weight of reality. Rachel sat at her desk in the architectural firm's open plan office, surrounded by blueprints and fabric samples for her current project. The space buzzed with activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low hum of conversation filling the air. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the beams. But Rachel couldn't focus on any of it. Her mind kept replaying the wedding, the feeling of dancing with Benjamin, the warmth of his hand on her waist. She'd checked her phone approximately 200 times over the weekend, hoping for a text or call that never came. Maybe she'd imagined the connection between them. Maybe it had just been wedding magic, the kind of fleeting enchantment that dissolved in the harsh light of ordinary life. Her computer pinged with a new email, and Rachel clicked on it absently, expecting another vendor, quote, or client revision request. Instead, she found herself staring at a message from her boss, asking her to come to his office immediately for an important meeting regarding a new project opportunity. Rachel's stomach twisted with a mixture of excitement and dread. New projects were always thrilling, but the urgency in the email suggested something bigger than usual. She saved her work, smoothed down her burgundy blouse, and made her way across the office to the glass-walled conference room where her boss waited. When she opened the door, the air left her lungs in a rush. Benjamin Cole stood by the window, his back to her, hands in the pockets of an impeccably tailored navy suit. The late afternoon sun created a halo effect around his dark hair, and for a moment Rachel wondered if she was hallucinating. He turned at the sound of the door, and their eyes met. The impact was just as powerful as it had been at the wedding, maybe more so now that she knew how it felt to be in his arms. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she caught the flash of something warm in his gray eyes before he shuttered it away. Her boss, Gregory, a jovial man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses, stood and gestured enthusiastically. Rachel's mind reeled as Gregory launched into an explanation. Benjamin's company was expanding, building a new headquarters that would house over 3,000 employees. They wanted cutting-edge design, sustainable materials, a space that would inspire creativity and collaboration. And they wanted Rachel's firm to handle it, with her as the lead architect. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. The kind of project that could define a career, put her on the map as a serious talent. But it also meant working closely with Benjamin for months, possibly longer. She'd have to separate her professional responsibilities from the feelings that had kept her awake for the past 2 nights. Throughout the meeting, Benjamin was the picture of corporate professionalism. He discussed timelines, budget expectations, his vision for the building with the same focused intensity she'd seen at the wedding. But occasionally, when Gregory was distracted by documents or phone calls, Benjamin's eyes would find hers across the table. In those brief moments, the professional mask slipped, revealing the man who'd held her while they danced, who'd looked at her like she was the most fascinating thing in the room. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Rachel had agreed to take on the project. her excitement about the work overriding her concerns about the personal complications. They scheduled follow-up sessions, site visits, preliminary design presentations. Benjamin shook hands with Gregory, then turned to Rachel. His hand was warm and strong, his grip firm but not aggressive. The touch sent familiar electricity racing up her arm. And from the slight tightening around his eyes, she knew he felt it too. After he left, Gregory practically danced around the conference room, celebrating the biggest commission their firm had ever received. Rachel smiled and nodded in all the right places, but her mind was elsewhere, already calculating how she would navigate the impossible situation she'd just agreed to. The next 2 weeks were torture. Rachel threw herself into research and initial concepts, spending long hours at her desk sketching ideas and creating digital models. Benjamin attended every meeting, professional and distant, treating her exactly like he would any other architect. They discussed floor plans and load-bearing walls, sustainability certifications, and energy-efficient systems. Never once did he reference the wedding or the connection that it sparked between them. Rachel told herself this was for the best. They were professionals with a job to do. Mixing business with personal feelings was a recipe for disaster. She repeated these mantras while lying awake at night, remembering how he'd smiled at her over whiskey, how his hand had felt on her waist, how his voice had sounded when he'd said she made him curious. During the day, she built walls around those memories, focusing solely on creating the best possible design. But in quiet moments, when she caught him watching her across the conference table, or when their hands accidentally brushed while examining blueprints, those walls crumbled like sand. It was Mia who finally forced the issue. She showed up at Rachel's apartment on a Friday evening with takeout. Chinese food and a determination to intervene. Mia set the food containers on Rachel's small dining table with more force than necessary, the cardboard thumping against the wood. Rachel stabbed at her fried rice with a plastic fork. Avoiding Mia's knowing gaze, Rachel's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, the plastic clattering against the container. Mia leaned forward, her expression softening. The words hit harder than Rachel expected, bringing tears to her eyes that she blinked away furiously. She stood abruptly, pacing to her apartment window that overlooked the city streets below. The evening light cast long shadows across the hardwood floors, and she watched people moving on the sidewalk, all of them seemingly sure of where they were going. Mia came to stand beside her. Placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, Rachel pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Rachel turned to face her friend. Seeing the truth reflected in Mia's sympathetic eyes, she'd been lying to herself, pretending that professionalism and emotional distance were possible. But every time Benjamin walked into a room, every time he spoke in that low, measured voice, every time their eyes met across a table full of architectural plans, she felt it. The pull, the wanting, the terrifying possibility of something real after Mia left. Rachel sat in her darkening apartment, the city lights twinkling to life outside her window. She picked up her phone multiple times, typed and deleted messages to Benjamin, her thumb hovering over the send button before chickening out. Finally, exhausted by her own indecision, she wrote something simple and honest. She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately wanted to throw her phone across the room. What had she done? He was her client. This could jeopardize everything. Her phone rang less than a minute later. Benjamin's name glowed on the screen. Rachel answered with shaking hands, pressing the phone to her ear. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual control. Rachel heard traffic in the background, the distant sound of horns and engines. Benjamin's next words changed everything. Rachel's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard she was sure he could hear it through the phone. His voice dropped lower. Intimate, despite the distance between them, Rachel's knees went weak. She sank onto her couch, gripping the phone like a lifeline. She heard him exhale, a sound that might have been relief or frustration or both. They met on the rooftop terrace of Benjamin's office building, a private space accessible only to him. The night air was cool against Rachel's skin, carrying the scent of the city. Exhaust and pavement mixed with the faint sweetness of flowers from planters scattered around the terrace's perimeter. The skyline spread out before them in a glittering panorama. Millions of lights creating a constellation of human ambition and dreams. Benjamin stood by the railing when she arrived, still wearing his work clothes, his tie loosened, and the top button of his shirt undone. He turned at the sound of the rooftop door opening, and the expression on his face made Rachel's breath catch. There was no professional distance now, no corporate mask, just raw honesty and a hunger that matched her own. Rachel crossed the space between them, her heels clicking on the concrete. When she reached him, she didn't stop to think or second-guess or protect herself. She just acted, rising on her toes and kissing him. The kiss was fierce and desperate, weeks of tension and denial exploding between them. Benjamin's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, while he kissed her back with an intensity that made her dizzy. He tasted like coffee and mint, familiar and exciting all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, dark lashes fanning across his cheekbones. Rachel's hands fisted in his shirt. Holding him close, Benjamin opened his eyes, and the look in them made her heart turn over. Rachel laughed shakily. The sound caught between joy and tears, this time when he kissed her. It was slower, deeper, a promise rather than a question. Rachel melted into him, letting herself feel everything she'd been fighting. Want, hope, the terrifying vulnerability of caring about someone who had the power to hurt her when they came up for air again. Benjamin kept her wrapped in his arms, one hand stroking her hair, while the other traced patterns on her back through the thin fabric of her blouse. Rachel tilted, her head back to look at him. Finding his face open and unguarded in a way she'd never seen before, she took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. Benjamin's smile was slow and devastating, transforming his face from handsome to absolutely beautiful. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose, before finding her lips again. They stood on that rooftop for hours, talking and kissing and learning each other, the city sprawling below them while they created something new and fragile and precious. Much later, they sat on one of the terrace benches. Rachel tucked against Benjamin's side, his arm around her shoulders. The night had grown deeper, quieter, the traffic sounds fading to a distant murmur. Rachel looked up at him, this man who'd crashed into her life and refused to leave. She thought about that morning in the hotel hallway, about spilling wine on his expensive shirt, about every moment that had led them here. It felt like fate, like something inevitable that they'd both been running toward without knowing it. Benjamin pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice a low rumble against her hair. Rachel smiled against his chest, breathing in his scent. Feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, in the weeks and months that followed, they figured it out together. Benjamin transferred primary oversight of the headquarters project to his business partner, removing the direct conflict of interest while still staying involved enough to see Rachel's vision come to life. They navigated the complications of a high-profile relationship, dealing with curious colleagues and invasive media attention with a united front. The building Rachel designed became her masterpiece, a soaring structure of glass and sustainable materials that captured light and transformed it into art. On the day it opened, Benjamin gave a speech crediting her vision and talent, his eyes finding hers in the crowd with a warmth that made her blush. That night, in his apartment overlooking the city they both loved, Benjamin pulled out a small velvet box. Rachel's hands shook as she opened it, revealing a ring that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Rachel's answer was a kiss, fierce and loving, full of promise for all the days ahead. She'd been late to that wedding, rushed and chaotic and completely unprepared. But in crashing into Benjamin Cole, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Someone who saw her completely, challenged her constantly, and loved her desperately. Sometimes, she would tell their friends later, being late is exactly the right timing, and some collisions are actually destiny announcing its arrival.